Hi, I'm Jay. Today we're starting with some of the very basic techniques for jig tying. Stay tuned. So, good morning. Today we're at the bench, and I'm going to begin this series, which will be very basic steps in jig tying. So my thought is that these will be very short instructional videos that will really look at detail steps in the process of tying jigs, primarily bucktails, but as we get through the series, these techniques and steps will be able to carry over into other types of jig tying, micro jigs, crappie jigs, feathers, marabou, etc. So today what we're talking about will be just locking on thread. Now we're going to touch a little bit on bobbins. We'll talk just briefly about them. In setting up your bobbin, we'll perhaps touch briefly on what thread to use and why. And then we'll just show in fine detail the simple step of locking our thread on. So we'll begin with the bobbins. It doesn't matter what type of bobbin you use. You want your bobbin to match the size of your spool. So the techniques or the specifics that we talk about here today, it will carry over both to your smaller, lighter thread type bobbin, to your larger, and this is a size A rod wrapping thread, 950 yard spool. So this bobbin's pretty large. It will include the smaller bobbins. It doesn't matter what the shape of them are. It will carry over to each of them. So ideally, when you thread your bobbin, you want to adjust the tension with the feet. You can press them in to make it a little bit tighter, spread them out to make them a little bit looser. But the idea, you want to be able to pull your thread out with very little effort, but when you hold it up, you don't want it to unravel. Okay. When we wrap our thread around and lock our thread on to the hook, if we let the bobbin hang, we want it to maintain tension on the thread, but we don't want it to unravel. If we lay it on our desk, lay the spool on our desk and lay it down at an angle so there's still tension on your thread. You don't want it to unravel. But we don't want it to be so tight that you can't pull it out. Okay, I'm just holding this lightly with 2 fingers and just pulling. Okay. I know there are some bobbins that have screws that tighten or loosen to adjust the tension on your spool, but when we tie, the tension that we place on our thread comes from our hands. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about some founding tires. One of my all-time favorite tires is Helen Shaw. She has a few books from, I think, about the 50s, 60s, instructional books that were very well done. Her husband was a photographer for outdoors magazines, so they really had an idea of what the pictures should be in terms of an instructional type video or an instructional type book. And her book, Fly Tying Materials, Tools, and Techniques, is a very good book in learning fly tying, but all those instructions that she gave, those applications transfer over to jig tying. Now, Helen Shaw described the tying technique that we use is a continuous tying technique, and all that meant to say was that you lock your thread on in the beginning, the first step, and then as we add materials to the hook shank, it's the same line. We don't cut it, we don't retie. It's from start to finish. You're using the thread from a single spool. Now, an interesting thing on how Helen Shaw tied is that she did not use a bobbin, at least for the larger flies like streamers. She did use a vise, but tied everything just in hand, so to speak, no bobbin, just thread in hand, and used a rubber stopper attached to the side of her desk to, if she needed both hands, she could loop the thread through the rubber stopper so she could let go and it would maintain tension on her hook. The other books that kind of touch on this aspect of tying, Sam Slaymaker has a book titled Tie a Fly, Catch a Trout, where he describes the thread that we use is you want to use the smallest diameter for the, or you want to choose the diameter thread that matches the size hook you're tying. So if you're tying a smaller fly on a smaller hook, you are using a smaller diameter thread. In my tying videos, I talk a lot about size A rod wrapping thread for jigs, 1/4 in size or bigger, and a 2/0 or a 3/0 round nylon thread for jigs that are smaller than 1/4 ounce. Those are the two sizes that I tie with primarily, not exclusively, but primarily. Size A for larger jigs, 2/0 nylon thread for smaller jigs. And the last book I'll mention, and it's a book that I've talked about in a few different videos, is from Ken Oberek, Angler's Guide to Jig and Jigging, where he specifically states size A rod wrapping thread or larger, and 2/0 or 3/0 nylon thread for smaller jigs. My opinions on which thread to use, which is best, is not new. And the last thing we'll touch on just briefly is waxed versus unwaxed. Now, all the thread I use is just a round nylon unwaxed. There are reasons to choose a waxed thread over an unwaxed thread, and that'll be a whole new video. A waxed thread is the wax being used because it's a flat thread like a floss, and the wax is used to tame those fibers, to keep them from becoming unruly. Is the wax used for buoyancy? Is the wax being used for waterproofness? Is the wax being used as a binding agent? Early fly tyers that didn't have access to head cements or lacquers, you could use a heavily waxed thread, so when you tied your knot it wouldn't come undone. The wax would coat the thread to keep it from absorbing water. The wax was used to help the thread stay buoyant. So there's reasons to use a thread that's waxed, and though you can use regular fly tying thread that you'll find at any of your local shops, when possible, I always recommend a round nylon unwaxed thread. So let's switch over to the vise. I'll turn on my face, and we're just going to show the simple steps of just locking on our thread. Doesn't matter which type of jig you want to use to practice this. Anything bigger than a quarter would be perfect as a practice jig, just because your hook shank would be a length that would allow wrapping in a few different locations. And this is just practice. Whenever tires, whenever you get a chance, just sit down, practice what you're doing. I'm just going to use my size A rod wrapping thread. This is just a good rod. And very simply, holding the bobbin in your right hand and your tag end in your left hand, you just lay this straight across the hook shank, and as you come around, you angle your thread so it overlaps onto itself. And here we have open wraps covering your tag end, and I just went back about a third of the way on the hook shank. And as we're tying jigs, we return the thread up to the head again with open wraps, and now we're ready to add hair. My bobbin is hanging so it's not touching the table, and you can just see the point of my bobbin on the screen, and as you can tell, it's not pulling itself down. If I pulled out a little bit more thread, I could lay the bobbin on my desk, but it's still at an angle so your tag end stays taut. Two other locations that as a jig tire you're going to lock on the thread. Locking on the thread is the same process. The only difference is the location on the hook shank. When we lock the thread on up near the head, you kind of have the luxury of, you can add a little bit of pressure where you can feel the head of the jig itself, and it gives you a little bit confidence, a little bit more confidence in locking on your thread. But the next section would be in the middle of the hook shank, and that was pretty quick, so we'll do that again. But the middle of the hook shank. So this would be in tying, locking in materials like a tail for a crappie jig, as an example, maybe a marabou tail or a duck feather. We lay our thread perpendicular to the hook shank right across the top. As we come around, we just overlap it on itself. And as we can see here, I use touching wraps, so my thread wraps were side by side, about 1/8 of an inch, and then I could reverse and go just to the right hand side of our first wrap, and it's locked into place. Now that's not going to move, so if you use good overlapping techniques, there's no reason to use head cement, Sally Hansen's lacquer to glue your threads on, because that is not going to go anywhere. That's tied on well. The third and final location, which is very similar to locking it on in the center of the hook shank, and again, an area where you would lock thread on when adding a tail, adding chenille, tinsel, anything like that, is locking it on back near the hook point. And again, it's simply just holding your thread in place, applying some tension with your left hand so your thread doesn't slide as you rotate around, and it's adding wraps towards the bend of the hook over your tag end, and then reversing your direction and crossing it over on itself, which locks it into place. And that's all there is to locking your thread onto the hook shank. That's the first step in tying jigs. The idea behind these videos is that as we go through step by step, any groups using this for instruction can string those videos together, and you'll have a very simple progression, step by step, locking on your thread, adding hair, finishing a collar, a completed jig. So that's the idea behind some of these videos, and I've been very pleased to hear there's a couple groups that actually do use my videos for instruction, which I think is fantastic. But I think that's going to do it for us today. If there's any groups out there and you'd like to send me some, message me, private message me, send me photos of your groups or information, what you enjoy using out of the videos, and maybe some ideas of things that you would really like us to focus on. Private message me that. I would love to respond to those, as well as, it helps me identify what we need to do with these videos here. But I think that's going to do it for us today. Hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss any new content. And keep practicing, guys, in tight lines.